Mason Carter pulled his truck over that cold morning when he saw an elderly man struggling beside a gray sedan with a flat tire. He did not know who the man was, only that his hands were shaking. Mason knelt, loosened the lug nuts, and swapped in the spare without complaint. When the old man reached for his wallet, Mason waved it off and turned to leave. A black Rolls-Royce stopped behind him. The door opened and a composed CEO stepped out, freezing as she recognized her father beside the man she had rejected for a job 2 days before. If you believe kindness always finds its way back, stay with this story all the way to its final moment. The last stretch of autumn had settled hard over the Connecticut suburbs that week, turning the mornings gray and the roads quiet before sunrise. Mason Carter drove the same route every day toward Cedar Ridge Auto, a modest repair shop where he had picked up extra hours after the company he used to work for was absorbed into a much larger operation called Whitmore Automotive Group. It was not the career he had imagined for himself, but it paid the bills, kept his hands busy, and let him be home most evenings for his daughter. Mason had once been a reliability engineer with a reputation for catching problems before they became disasters. After his wife passed away several years earlier, he made a deliberate choice to step back from the travel-heavy roles that had once defined his career. He wanted stability more than prestige, predictability more than a bigger title. Being a single father was not something he talked about often, but it shaped nearly every decision he made, including the quiet acceptance of a smaller paycheck in exchange for evenings that belonged to his family. That particular morning carried an extra weight. An email had arrived the night before informing him that he had not been selected for the Director of Field Reliability position at Whitmore Automotive Group, a role he had pursued through several rounds of interviews that he genuinely believed had gone well. He read the message twice, feeling the familiar sting of disappointment, but he did not let it curdle into bitterness. He closed his laptop, made coffee, and got ready for another ordinary day at the shop. The road that morning was nearly empty. As Mason approached a long, straight stretch lined with bare trees, he noticed a gray sedan pulled crookedly onto the shoulder. An older man stood beside it, struggling with a jack that would not sit level on the uneven ground. Most drivers passed without slowing down. Mason glanced at the clock on his dashboard, calculated how much of his buffer time he could afford to lose, and eased his truck onto the shoulder anyway. He climbed out, zipping his jacket against the wind. The old man straightened up, embarrassed and a little wary, and offered his name simply as Joseph. Mason did not ask what he did for a living, whether he could afford a tow truck, or why he was driving alone on such a cold morning. None of that mattered to him. He only said in a calm and unhurried voice that Joseph should step back from the lane and let him take care of the rest. Mason crouched beside the sedan and found the problem immediately worse than a simple puncture. The sidewall had torn open in a long gash, the kind that no patch kit could fix on the roadside. He walked to the trunk, retrieved the jack, the lug wrench, and the spare tire Joseph kept tucked beneath a thin gray mat, and got to work without any further discussion. As he loosened the lug nuts, something caught his attention. 2 of them had been torqued far beyond what the manufacturer specified, and one showed the faint beginning of deformation around its threads. He held it up so Joseph could see, explaining in plain terms that if the vehicle continued to be serviced this way, the flat tire might end up being the least of his problems down the road. Joseph leaned in, studying the lug nut with real interest rather than polite nodding. He asked what Mason did for work. Mason kept his answer simple, saying only that he worked at a repair shop nearby. But Joseph had spent enough of his life around engineers and mechanics to recognize the difference between someone who simply changed oil and someone who understood torque specifications, thread wear, and contact surfaces at a deeper level. He remarked, almost to himself, that a person did not learn these things just to keep a shop running. Mason allowed himself a small, tired laugh. He admitted he had once worked as a reliability engineer, though he kept the conversation from turning into a recitation of his old accomplishments. He was not there to impress anyone. He was there because a stranger needed help on a cold morning, and that was reason enough. Grateful and a little stunned by the thoroughness of the repair, Joseph reached for his wallet and offered Mason $200 for his trouble. Mason shook his head and declined. Joseph pressed again, insisting it was the least he could do. Mason still refused, telling him gently that Joseph did not need to pay for something that any decent person should have done without being asked. The words settled over Joseph in a way that seemed to catch him off guard. He fell quiet for a moment, watching Mason gather the tools and wipe his hands on a rag from his own truck. As Mason prepared to leave, Joseph asked for his full name almost as an afterthought. "Mason Carter," he said, Something shifted, faint but unmistakable, across Joseph's expression. It was the kind of recognition that comes not from memory exactly, but from the sense that a name had crossed his desk somewhere before, in some file he could not immediately place. Before either of them could say anything else, the low, exceptionally smooth hum of an expensive engine rose behind them. A sleek black Rolls-Royce eased to a stop just a few feet away, its polished exterior catching the pale morning light. The rear door of the Rolls-Royce opened before the driver could reach for it. Amelia Whitmore stepped out, moving quickly and without any of the practiced composure she usually carried into a boardroom. This was not a grand entrance meant for anyone's benefit. She had spent the last hour trying to reach her father on his phone, growing more anxious with each unanswered call. Joseph had turned down his usual driver that morning, insisting on taking the old sedan out himself, the same car his late wife had once loved to drive along these back roads. Amelia had not been able to shake the unease that settled over her the moment he stopped answering. She crossed the shoulder and checked her father first, confirming with a few quick questions that he was unharmed. Only then did her eyes move to the man standing beside him, hands still faintly stained with grease, a rag draped over one shoulder. Recognition passed between them almost instantly. 2 days earlier, Mason had sat through the final round of interviews for the Director of Field Reliability position. Amelia had joined the call for only its last few minutes, but she remembered him clearly because of one answer that stood apart from everything else she had heard that day. When asked how he would choose between profit and safety if the two ever came into direct conflict, Mason had answered without hesitation that if they truly conflicted, the system had already been designed wrong from the very beginning. That very morning, Amelia had signed off on the final hiring list for the position. Mason's name was not on it. Joseph, sensing the sudden tension between them, asked his daughter directly if she knew this man. "Mr. Carter applied to the company recently," Amelia said carefully. Joseph pressed further, and a pause stretched out longer than either of them wanted. "We chose someone else," she admitted. Joseph looked down at the freshly changed tire, then back at Mason's stained hands. His voice carried no anger, only a quiet, pointed disappointment. "That is a shame," he said. "Considering the man you did not hire stopped to help an old man on the side of the road while dozens of other cars simply drove past." Mason, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken, spoke up quickly. He made it clear that the hiring decision and the roadside repair were two completely separate matters, and he did not want Amelia to feel any sense of obligation because of what had happened that morning. It was precisely that instinct, the refusal to leverage the moment for his own advantage, that made Amelia look at him more closely than she had during their brief interview call. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for the calculation she expected to find and coming up empty. In her line of work, people rarely helped without eventually asking for something in return, and the absence of that expectation left her strangely unsettled. Joseph, meanwhile, was watching his daughter with quiet curiosity, sensing that something more than a chance roadside encounter had just taken place. He said nothing further, choosing instead to let the moment breathe rather than push either of them toward a conclusion neither seemed ready to reach. Amelia offered to have her driver take Mason wherever he needed to go, given how much time he had already lost helping her father. Mason declined politely and walked back to his own pickup truck instead, preferring the familiar creak of its worn seat over the polished interior of a car he had no business riding in. Joseph laughed under his breath, clearly delighted by the refusal. Before they parted ways, Joseph pulled a plain business card from his coat pocket and handed it to Mason. "This is not about the tire," he said. "I would like to talk to you about what you noticed on that wheel." At the headquarters of Whitmore Automotive, Amelia returned to her usual demanding schedule of meetings and approvals. Yet the encounter on the roadside kept surfacing in her thoughts, pulling her focus away from spreadsheets and quarterly projections in a way she found difficult to explain. She asked her assistant to pull up Mason's application file again, this time reading through it far more carefully than she had during the original review. What she found troubled her. His technical scores placed him among the strongest candidates the company had seen in years. His hands-on experience exceeded every requirement listed for the role. Every engineer who interviewed him had left glowing notes about his judgment and clarity under pressure. But buried within an internal evaluation written by Logan Hayes, the company's chief operating officer, was a note describing Mason as having exhibited resistance to management during his time at a smaller company Whitmore had recently acquired. Logan had concluded that Mason was not suited for a senior leadership culture, and that assessment had quietly carried enough weight to remove him from consideration. Amelia had trusted Logan's judgment without question in the past. Now she found herself reading the note again and again, searching for context that simply was not there. The timing struck her as strange. The supposed conflict had occurred right around the same period Mason had flagged a maintenance process that failed to meet company standards. A seed of doubt took root, though Amelia was careful not to let a single roadside gesture rewrite her judgment entirely. She reminded herself that kindness toward a stranger, however genuine, did not automatically prove someone capable of managing a system that affected billions of dollars in vehicles and the safety of everyone who drove them. She decided the only responsible course of action was to dig deeper and find out what had actually happened. At the same moment, across the building, Joseph asked the engineering team to send him the latest report on a problem that had been quietly frustrating Whitmore for weeks. A new fleet of test vehicles kept developing an unexplained vibration in the rear wheel assembly after only a few thousand miles on the road, and no one on staff had managed to pin down the exact cause. Joseph thought back to how quickly Mason had spotted a subtle problem in only a few minutes on the side of a cold, empty road, and he found himself unable to let the coincidence go. Later that afternoon, Joseph arrived at Cedar Ridge Auto on his own, without a driver, without an entourage, and without any hint of the wealth that surrounded his family name. He stood near the entrance for several minutes, quietly watching Mason work on an ordinary sedan, before finally introducing himself as the founder of Whitmore Automotive Group. Mason blinked in surprise, but his manner did not change. He wiped his hands, shook Joseph's outstretched hand, and waited to hear what had brought him there. Joseph explained the vibration problem plaguing the company's newest vehicle program. 3 separate engineering teams had already examined the issue without reaching a clear consensus on its cause. He was not there to ask Mason to save the company single-handedly. He simply asked a single, direct question. If Mason had 2 hours with one of the faulty vehicles, what would he check first? Mason answered without hesitation, walking Joseph through a logical sequence any experienced reliability engineer would recognize. He would start with the maintenance history, then check the torque specifications applied to the wheels, examine the hub surface for signs of warping, measure brake temperatures under load, look for bearing misalignment, and compare vehicles serviced at different maintenance centers to spot any pattern in how they had been handled. Joseph listened closely, nodding at each point, and then extended an invitation. He asked Mason to come to the testing facility as an independent paid consultant, not as an employee of the. Mason accepted, understanding this to be a clear professional arrangement rather than an act of charity extended out of guilt. Amelia was enthusiastic when she learned of her father's decision. She argued that bringing a recently rejected candidate into an internal investigation was, at best, an unusual choice and, at worst, a serious lapse in judgment that could complicate matters further. Joseph responded simply, telling her that if she had doubts, she should judge Mason by the results he produced, rather than by the resume that had already been decided upon. Amelia agreed, but only under one condition. Mason would receive no special treatment and no shortcuts because of his connection to her father. Word of the arrangement reached Mason before he even arrived at the facility, and when he heard the condition, he simply replied that it was exactly what he wanted as well. The relationship between Mason and Amelia began at that point, rooted entirely in professional caution rather than any personal warmth. Neither of them expected anything more than a working arrangement bound by clear rules and mutual skepticism. Amelia watched him from a distance during his first hours at the facility, still uncertain whether her father's instinct about this stranger would prove sound or simply sentimental. For his part, Mason kept his focus entirely on the data in front of him, determined to prove nothing except his own competence, and careful not to let the strange circumstances of his arrival distract him from the actual engineering problem at hand. At the Whitmore Technical Center, Mason did not rush toward the vehicles themselves. Instead, he spent his first hours buried in data, comparing service records from vehicles that had developed the vibration against those that had not. A pattern began to emerge almost immediately. Every affected vehicle had passed through one particular group of service centers, all of which had recently adopted a new wheel torquing procedure. Mason asked to inspect the tools those centers were using, along with the digital instructions technicians followed during routine maintenance. What he found explained everything. The problem was not a flaw in the vehicle's design. It was not a material defect, and it had nothing to do with any outside supplier. A recent update to the internal maintenance software had introduced an error in unit conversion within certain torque instructions, causing technicians to tighten the wheels far beyond the intended specification without realizing it. This single detail explained exactly what had happened to Joseph's own sedan weeks earlier. Amelia, who had been quietly monitoring the investigation from a distance, found herself developing genuine respect for how methodically Mason worked. He did not chase theories. He followed the evidence wherever it led, one careful step at a time. But there was something even more troubling buried beneath the surface. An engineer had actually flagged this exact irregularity 6 weeks earlier. The report had been closed out and marked as requiring no further action. The final approval on that decision traced back to a division under Logan Hayes's direct authority. Mason was careful not to draw any conclusions about intent. He did not accuse Logan of deliberately burying the report. Instead, he simply requested additional documentation and asked for a clearer accounting of who had reviewed the original complaint and why it had been dismissed so quickly. That restraint was exactly what impressed Amelia most. Mason had every reason to use this discovery as leverage against the very system that had rejected him only days earlier. Instead, he stuck rigidly to the data, refusing to let personal history color his professional judgment. The two of them began working late into the evening, poring over spreadsheets and service logs together at a long table near the testing bay. Somewhere between the technical discussions, quieter moments began to surface. Amelia discovered that Mason had a dry, understated sense of humor that only appeared once he felt comfortable around someone. Mason, in turn, began to see past the composed, guarded executive persona Amelia carried into every meeting, glimpsing instead a woman who lived in constant fear of making a mistake that might damage the legacy her father had built from nothing. Neither of them acknowledged what was happening between them, not yet. Whatever connection was forming grew out of mutual respect long before it grew into anything resembling romance, and both of them seemed instinctively aware that rushing it would cheapen whatever it eventually became. Word of Mason's investigation eventually reached Logan Hayes, and he understood immediately what it could mean for him. Rather than waiting for the findings to surface on their own, he moved quickly to reframe the entire situation as something personal rather than technical. During a leadership meeting, Logan argued that Mason was nothing more than a rejected applicant trying to prove the company wrong for not hiring him. He then made a point of bringing up an old complaint from Mason's file, describing an incident in which Mason had allegedly halted a production line without proper authorization, resulting in significant financial losses for the company at the time. Mason did not deny it. The room fell silent, waiting to see how he would respond. He explained the rest of the story calmly. He had stopped the line after discovering a batch of components that failed to meet safety standards. The company later confirmed that the flawed parts carried a real risk of serious failure if they had gone unnoticed. His decision had delayed production by a single day, but it had prevented what could have become a much larger recall affecting thousands of vehicles already on dealer lots. Logan had conveniently left that part of the story out of his account. Amelia realized with a growing sense of unease that she was the one who had signed off on rejecting Mason based on a file that had never included this context. It was a quiet, uncomfortable turning point for her, one she did not try to smooth over with an easy apology delivered in front of the room. Instead, she called for a full audit of the entire hiring decision and the events surrounding it. Logan's composure began to slip. He warned Amelia that pausing the new vehicle program, even temporarily, would spook investors and jeopardize existing dealer agreements across several states. Mason, once again, found himself facing a familiar and uncomfortable choice between protecting safety and protecting a release schedule. He recommended that Whitmore halt deliveries of any vehicle within the affected group until a full inspection could be completed. The decision ultimately rested with Amelia, and she understood exactly what was at stake either way. She chose safety. "Stop the deliveries," she said, her voice steady despite the pressure building around her. Logan understood in that moment that his grip on the situation and on his own position within the company was beginning to slip through his fingers, no matter how forcefully he argued otherwise. He left the meeting visibly rattled, already searching for another angle to protect himself before the audit could reach any further into his decisions. Outside the conference room, Mason waited quietly while Amelia gathered her notes. Neither of them spoke about what had just happened between them and Logan. There was no need. The tension in the room had been obvious to everyone present, and both of them understood that the coming days would determine far more than the fate of a single vehicle program. It would determine whether the company Joseph had spent decades building still operated by the principles he had founded it on, or whether those principles had quietly eroded somewhere along the way without anyone noticing until now. The audit confirmed something important. Logan had not been the one who introduced the original torque conversion error. That mistake had come from a genuine system flaw, one that had slipped past several layers of testing before ever reaching production. This detail mattered, because it kept the story honest rather than reducing Logan to a simple villain who had caused every problem from the beginning. His true failure was different, and in some ways more damning. He had known about the risk and chosen to delay addressing it in order to protect the launch timeline and the performance bonus tied to his own department's numbers. Internal messages showed that he had personally instructed a subordinate to lower the priority level of the original report, effectively burying it under routine paperwork. The same messages revealed that Logan had also worked to keep Mason out of the hiring process altogether, once he recognized him as the same engineer who had pushed back against cost-cutting maintenance practices at the smaller company Whitmore had recently absorbed. Amelia called an emergency meeting with the board once the evidence had been compiled. Logan made one final attempt to defend himself, accusing Amelia of allowing her father to interfere in corporate operations and of showing favoritism toward a man she had only recently met. Mason chose to remove himself entirely from the vote that followed. He told Amelia plainly that she did not need to defend him personally. She only needed to defend the decision that the evidence clearly supported. That single sentence helped Amelia steady herself in front of the board. She laid out the evidence methodically, without emotion, letting the documents speak for themselves rather than relying on personal appeals. The board's decision came quickly. Logan was suspended immediately and formally terminated once the official investigation concluded. An emergency inspection program was launched across every affected vehicle still on the road or awaiting delivery. No serious accidents were ultimately traced back to the flawed torque procedure, a fact that brought quiet relief to everyone involved in the process. Mason did not emerge from the ordeal as some singular hero who had rescued the entire company through his own brilliance alone. He was, more accurately, the person who first noticed the pattern that others had missed, and the engineering teams at Whitmore worked together afterward to confirm the root cause and correct it properly across every affected system. That distinction mattered to Mason more than anyone realized. He had spent years watching companies turn individual employees into either scapegoats or saviors, and he wanted no part of either narrative. He simply wanted the problem fixed and the people who might have been harmed by it protected before anything worse could happen. Joseph watched the entire situation unfold from a quiet distance, saying little in public and refusing every opportunity to insert himself into the process. He trusted his daughter to handle the company the way he had once handled it himself, and he trusted Mason to keep doing exactly what he had done since the very first morning on that empty road, which was simply telling the truth about what he found, regardless of who it implicated or what it might cost him personally. After the dust from the crisis settled, Amelia asked Mason to meet her in a small conference room. There was no board present this time. No lawyers, no father waiting nearby, and no luxury car parked outside to signal her arrival. Just the two of them and a folder resting on the table between them. She opened it and slid his original application across to him. "I signed off on rejecting you without looking deeply enough into the file," she admitted, without softening the truth or reaching for an excuse to explain it away. She apologized directly, without qualifying the apology or shifting blame onto anyone else involved in the original decision. Then she placed a new offer on the table, one that named the exact position he had applied for from the very beginning, Director of Field Reliability. Mason did not accept immediately. Instead, he asked her 3 questions, each one deliberate and clearly weighed long before he walked into the room. Would he have the authority to halt a process if he found genuine evidence of a safety risk? Would frontline employees be able to report problems without fear of retaliation hanging over their heads? And did she, as the chief executive, genuinely want to hear the things she might not want to hear? Amelia answered yes to each one, without hesitation and without the practiced polish she sometimes used in front of investors. "Then I accept," Mason said simply. When Joseph heard the news, he only smiled quietly to himself. He made no effort to claim credit for what had happened. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else involved, that Mason had never needed someone to hand him an opportunity out of pity or obligation. He had only needed a place honest enough not to bury the talent that was already there in front of everyone. Joseph noticed something else developing in the weeks that followed, something neither Mason nor Amelia had openly acknowledged yet. Amelia began finding reasons to walk through Mason's department more often than her schedule strictly required. And Mason, who had remained perfectly composed in front of every executive at Whitmore, started straightening his collar without quite realizing it whenever she stepped through the door. Neither of them rushed to name what was happening between them. The connection grew the way most lasting things do, through small, quiet gestures rather than any grand declaration, each one adding weight to something neither of them was yet ready to say out loud. Mason moved into his new role with the same steady discipline he had brought to every job before it. He did not treat the offer as a personal victory over Logan or as proof that he had been right all along. He treated it as an opportunity to build something that might actually prevent the next crisis before it ever had the chance to begin, and that quiet sense of purpose was, in its own way, far more satisfying to him than any title on a business card could ever be. 3 months later, the maintenance system Mason built had already reduced field failures across the company by a meaningful margin. More importantly, Whitmore established a new process that allowed frontline technicians to escalate safety concerns directly to the reliability department, bypassing the layers of bureaucracy that had once let a critical warning sit buried for weeks. Mason refused every opportunity to build a personal spotlight around the story of the man who stopped on the roadside and ended up saving the company. He insisted, whenever the subject came up, that the outcome belonged to the entire engineering team, not to any single person who happened to notice a pattern first. Amelia's trust in him deepened steadily during this period, built through months of consistent, careful work rather than any single dramatic moment. Both of them maintained clear professional boundaries throughout the active phase of the investigation and the rollout that followed. It was only after the project reached completion, once Mason no longer reported directly to Amelia in any formal capacity, that anything personal between them truly began to take shape. One evening, Joseph invited them both to dinner. At the very last minute, he claimed to be too busy to join them after all, a transparent excuse that fooled neither of them, but that he delivered anyway with an entirely straight face. Mason understood immediately what his old friend was doing. Amelia, for the first time since Mason had known her, looked genuinely flustered. He could not help but laugh. The composed, sharp-minded executive who never lost her footing in a boardroom had, for once, completely lost the upper hand in a much smaller and far more personal moment. There was no extravagant restaurant, no grand declaration of feelings. They simply went for coffee afterward and talked about the parts of their lives that existed entirely outside of work. Mason spoke honestly about learning how to rebuild a life after loss, about the slow, unglamorous work of grief that never fully disappears but eventually becomes something a person learns to carry. Amelia spoke about the quiet pressure of being expected to inherit and protect a legacy someone else had spent an entire lifetime building. The distance that had once separated a CEO and a rejected job candidate had by that point simply dissolved, replaced by something far more equal and far more honest than either title ever could have described. They lingered at the small coffee shop long after their cups had gone cold, in no hurry to return to the schedules waiting for them the next morning. For the first time in longer than either could easily remember, neither of them felt the need to measure every word before saying it. It was a small thing, sitting across a table with no agenda and nothing left to prove, but it felt, to both of them, like the beginning of something worth protecting carefully. About a year had passed since that first cold morning on the shoulder of an empty road. Mason had settled fully into his role at Whitmore, earning the respect of the people who worked under him not because of any connection to the chief executive, but because of the steady, transparent way he led his team through every decision, large or small. Amelia had changed as well, though not in ways that made her any less decisive or any less sharp in a negotiation. She remained just as demanding of herself and everyone around her, but she no longer believed that a report or a spreadsheet could fully capture the truth of a situation without also understanding the people standing behind the numbers. The relationship between Mason and Amelia had grown slowly and deliberately, without any rush toward grand gestures or public announcements. They were dating seriously by then, comfortable in a rhythm that suited them both, with no urgent need for a wedding or a dramatic conclusion to prove what they already understood privately. Joseph still liked to remind them, at every family dinner, that all of it had started because of a single flat tire. On the evening this particular story reaches its final scene, Mason and Amelia were driving home after having dinner with Joseph. Ahead of them, on the same quiet stretch of road, They spotted another older man standing beside a car that had clearly broken down. Amelia checked the time. They were already running late for another commitment. Before Mason could say a single word, Amelia had already flipped on her hazard lights and begun easing the car onto the shoulder. Mason looked over at her, surprised and quietly pleased. Amelia only shrugged. "You taught me a rule once." "What rule was that?" "If you can help, you stop." They stepped out of the car together, without hesitation, without checking who the man was or whether helping him would cost them anything in return. There was no reward waiting for them this time. No secret billionaire hiding behind a worn coat. No black Rolls-Royce pulling up moments later to change the course of anyone's life. And that in the end was exactly what made the moment complete. On the day Mason first stopped to help Joseph, he had no idea he was helping the father of a powerful executive. He could not have known that the decision would eventually restart a career he thought he had quietly let go of, expose a dangerous flaw hidden inside a major company, and lead him toward a woman he would slowly, carefully come to love. He had simply seen someone who needed help, and he had chosen to stop. Joseph had never set out to change the course of Mason's life by handing him anything he had not already earned. He had only opened a door, one small and unremarkable door, so that the qualities Mason already carried inside himself could finally be seen by the people who mattered.